Bathsheba was born in a family that seemed to have the fate intertwined with the most striking events in Israel. His father, Eliah, was known for his bravery as one of King David's elite warriors, men of courage who lived to protect the kingdom. Her grandfather, Ahithophel, was a wise counselor, someone whose voice was heard carefully in the corridors of power. At that time, families like hers lived surrounded by duty and honor, but also under the weight of expectations and intrigues around the court. Just imagine, Jerusalem was seething. It was a city where each stone seemed to whisper stories of kings, battles, and the promise of a future in God's hands. Bathsheba grew in this environment, listening to the stories of the chosen people and the victories that put Israel on the map like a strong nation. She should be a young woman with a restless soul, like many at that time, full of dreams, but aware of the responsibilities that came with her position. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and activate the notification bell not to miss any video. As it was common for women of his lineage, Bathsheba married young with an honorable man named Urias, who, like his father, served to King David as one of his loyal warriors. The two lived in Jerusalem near the court, but also close to the dangers and dramas involving the big names in the kingdom. Every step she took was somehow watched by the eyes, attentive to a world that always expected something more of the people linked to the throne. She seemed to live a quiet life behind the scenes of the main stage. But on one day it seemed common. Something happened, something that would change the course of your life forever. It was just the beginning of a series of events that would lead the Bathsheba to become one of the most important and controversial figures in Israel's history. That day started like any other. The sun spread across the city of Jerusalem, its golden lights reflecting on the roofs of the houses, while the residents' routine followed as usual. In the king's palace, the movement was intense, as always. Counselors were going and came, messengers arrived with news from the battlefield. But to Bathsheba, that was just another day in the calm of his house. With her husband Uriah fighting for Israel, she followed her routine, taking care of the tasks and finding moments of rest in the intimacy of her home. When the heat of the day began to weigh, she decided to cool off. The bath was a private moment, a little relief in the middle of the busy life. At that moment, without her knowing, something was about to happen that would change her career forever. From the top of the palace, David walked down the terrace, perhaps seeking to lighten his thoughts or simply observing the city he led. And that's when he saw her. Bathsheba's view caught his attention in an irresistible way. The way the sun seemed to play with the water on his skin, the serenity of his movements, everything seemed to conspire to arrest him there, unable to look away. David was a man used to the power and desires he brought, but at that moment his desire surpassed the boundaries of what was right. He didn't know who she was, but something in his posture, maybe even the simplicity of the moment, made him determined to find out. David ordered them to bring her to the palace. Messengers were sent discreet, not to raise suspicions. And when she arrived, she was not just a woman before a king. It was the beginning of a choice that would seal their fate. When Bathsheba was taken to the palace, she could barely imagine the intentions behind that call. It was King David who had summoned her, and to anyone in Israel, a call from the king was something that could not be refused. She entered the imposing gates, perhaps with a mixture of curiosity and respect. The environment in the palace had an air of grandeur, but that night, something seemed different. There was a strange silence, as if even the corridors were holding their breath, waiting for what was to come. When she met David, the conversation started with kind words. He was known for his charisma, and it was not difficult to understand why so many people admired him. However, at that moment, David's gaze carried something deeper, a spark that went beyond the simple curiosity. He treated her as someone special, as if she were the only person who mattered right now. Maybe Drunk has been confused or even flattered, but it was impossible to ignore the weight of that situation. The time they spent together was sufficient for the boundaries to be exceeded. That night, David and Bathsheba succumbed to the desire he had taken over them. What began as a meeting between a king and a subject quickly became a heavy secret, something they both knew could not be revealed. She was a married woman, and David, even being king, knew that the law of God and his people had broken. A few days later, the tension in the air increased when Bathsheba sent a message to the king. His words were simple, but charged with a huge weight. "I'm pregnant." David, who until then might believe he could move on without much consequences, now via his choice trigger something much bigger than he expected. What he would do, he could define not only Bathsheba's fate, but of the whole kingdom. When Bathsheba's message came to David's hands, the king felt the weight of those words like a stone in his chest. "I am pregnant." Simple, direct, impossible to ignore. He knew the news would not just bring a personal scandal, but would endanger everything he had built. How could you justify a child with the wife of Uriah, one of the most loyal men in the kingdom? The solution was not easy, but the fear that everything would come out led him to act in a hurry and despair. David called Uriah back from the war, using as an excuse a false interest in learning more about progress on the battlefield. When Uriah arrived at the palace, he didn't suspect anything. He was a man with a pure heart, loyal to the king, loyal to his companions with arms, and above all to his wife. But David had a plan: send him home, to boot, and make it seem that his son was his. It was a risky strategy, but David believed that if it worked, everything would be resolved. Only Uriah was different. When David suggested that he would go home, rest, eat well, and sleep in his bed, Uriah refused. "How can I do this while my weapon brothers are sleeping on tents on the battlefield?" he said, with a determination that surprised the king himself. Uriah spent the night with the palace guards, unaware that his integrity frustrated David's plans. David tried again, this time offering wine and food in abundance, waiting for Uriah, drunk, to go home. But once again, Uriah remained faithful to his principles. Each new attempt made David more trapped, more aware that he could not cover up the error so easily. And then, with a mind obscured by fear and guilt, he made a decision that would change Uriah's fate forever. A letter, sealed with the king's own seal, was handed over to the loyal soldier without him knowing that he carried his death sentence. Uriah carried the letter like a faithful soldier, not knowing that the parchment hid his destination. It was ironic, almost cruel, to think that he, so honored, delivered into the hands of Joab, the army commander, a direct order of the king to his own death. David had written coldly, "Put Uriah on the front line of the hardest battle, then retreat so that he is injured and dies." Those words, as cold as a blade, were David's desperate attempt to erase a mistake that grew like a shadow over him. In the battlefield, Uriah struggled with the same fervor as always, without imagining that the plans drawn on his back were already in motion. The fight was fierce. The arrows crossed the sky like metal screams. Joab, obeying the king's orders, positioned Uriah exactly where the combat was more intense, where the chances of survival were almost null. Uriah advanced as the warrior who has always been, fearless and loyal until the last moment. He fell into the heat of battle, surrounded by enemies and betrayed by those who should protect him. When the news of his death arrived in David, the king received the message with a coldness. Perhaps he sighed with relief from thinking that with Uriah off the way, the secret would be safe. He sent words of consolation to Joab, saying, "Don't worry, the sword devours both this and that." It was as if trying to justify the tragedy, softening his guilt with empty words. After the period of mourning, David quickly took Bathsheba as his wife, trying to cover sin with a veil of normality. But his actions did not go unnoticed in the eyes of God. Prophet Nathan was sent to the palace, carrying a message that would be like a right arrow, designed to expose the truth and confront the king with the weight of his choices. When the prophet Nathan entered the palace, the environment seemed to carry an invisible weight. He was a respected man, known for speaking directly in the name of God. David received him, perhaps with a smile of false tranquility, but Nathan came with a message that the king did not expect. He began to speak, not with direct accusations, but with a simple story, a parable that seemed harmless. There were two men in a certain city, Nathan began. One was rich, having many sheep and oxen. The other was poor, having only a small sheep he loved as his own daughter. He fed her. She slept in his arms. It was all she had. One day, the rich man received a visitor, and instead of taking one of his many sheep, took the only sheep of the poor man to prepare a banquet. While Nathan told the story, David heard carefully, his heart burning with indignation. "This rich man must die," David exploded furiously. "How could you do that? He must pay 4 times more for what he did, because he had no mercy." For a moment the silence stopped in the air, and then Nathan looked straight at David with a firmness that made the king shudder. "You are this man," said the prophet, his words falling like thunder in silence. David was still, as if every word of Nathan were a blade cutting his soul. The prophet then revealed everything. God knew of sin, adultery with Bathsheba, the death of Uriah, and the useless effort of David to hide the truth. God's judgment was clear. The consequences would come. The son who Bathsheba was carrying in his womb would die, and the sword would never move away from David's house. Nathan's words shaken David deeply. He finally recognized the weight of what he had done. However, the announcement of the trial was only the beginning of the painful path that he and Bathsheba would have to walk together. And when their son was born, Nathan's prophecy began to be dark in a dark and inevitable manner. The birth of David's son and Bathsheba brought a mixture of joy and fear to the palace. But happiness was brief, like a candle that had barely been lit up before the wind erased it. The baby got sick severely, and the weight of Nathan's prophecy hovered over everyone. David, taken by despair, threw himself to the ground, fasting and praying. He did not eat, did not sleep. He spent his days crying out to God, asking for mercy to his son. Perhaps he would believe that with sufficient regret, the punishment could be reversed. Meanwhile, Bathsheba was in a silent corner of the palace, facing his own pain. It was a pain that no one could understand completely, not just the fear of losing a child, but the awareness that he paid the price for the mistakes she and David had made. The days dragged on, and the royal house seemed to plunge into a shadow that not even the golden ornaments of the throne could illuminate. However, the disease was relentless, and the baby passed away. When the servants informed David, they expected him to be taken by even more desperate mourning. But surprisingly, David got up, washed his face, changed his clothes, and went to the temple to worship God. The servants were confused. "Why now, after the child has died, do you act like this?" they asked. David replied with bitter serenity, "As he lived, I cried to God, thinking that perhaps he had mercy. But now he is gone. I can't bring it back. One day I will go to him, but he will not return to me." This devastating loss left deep scars, but also marked the beginning of a change in the heart of David and the fate of Bathsheba. God still had plans for her, and when another son was born, he was not just a sign of hope, but a living promise that even in the midst of the ruins, something new could arise. Solomon, God's chosen, was destined to be much more than just a prince on the throne of David. The birth of Solomon brought an unexpected light to the palace of David and Bathsheba. Unlike the first child, who came to the world amid the weight of divine judgment, Solomon was received with a promise of redemption. From the beginning, there was something special about him. When God, through the prophet Nathan, declared that he loved him, he even gave him a special name, Jedidiah, which means beloved of the Lord. It was as if Solomon carried a new chance in himself, not just for his parents, but to the whole kingdom. Bath, which had previously lived so many ups and downs, found in Solomon a new reason to move on. She created him carefully, knowing that he was not just his son, but someone intended for something grand. Meanwhile, life in the palace continued, full of intrigue and disputes between David's older children, each trying to secure their place. He carried a new chance in himself, not just for his parents, but to the whole kingdom. Bath, which had previously lived so many ups and downs, found in Solomon a new reason to move on. She created him carefully, knowing that he was not just his son, but someone intended for something grand. Meanwhile, life in the palace continued, full of intrigue and disputes between David's older children, each trying to secure their place in the succession to the throne. Despite his position as one of David's wives, he was constantly remembered that the way to Solomon's crown would not be easy. When the years passed and David began to grow old, the murmurs over who would inherit the throne intensified. Adonias, one of David's older children, believed that the right was his own and began to act as if he were already the king. He organized banquets, called allies, and built his power base. But Bathsheba was not stopped. Determined to protect Solomon's future, she sought the help of the prophet Nathan, who had been a faithful ally. Together they planned a way to ensure that David fulfilled his promise to crown Solomon. Bathsheba approached David in his last days, reminding him of the words he had said about Solomon being the successor chosen by God. Every word of his was carefully calculated, a balance between respect and firmness. And while the kingdom boiled with conspiracies, a decision needed to be made before it was too late to secure Solomon's place on the throne of Israel. The days in the palace were tense. Adonias, full of trust, already acted as if the throne were yours. He gathered powerful allies and organized a great banquet, inviting commanders, priests, and even influential members of the court to solidify his position. It was a bold movement, and everyone who watched knew it was more than a simple celebration. He proclaimed himself king, while David, weakened by age, seemed increasingly distant from the affairs of the kingdom. But in the midst of this whirlwind, Bathsheba wasted no time. She knew she needed to act quickly to secure Solomon's future. With Nathan's support, the prophet who was so often the voice of God in the kingdom, she drew a careful plan. As Adonijah tried to gather strength, Bathsheba entered the king's quarters, where David rested, aged and fragile, but still with the authority of a king. With a calm but firm voice, she remembered David of her promise. "My Lord, my King, you swore to the Lord, the God of Israel, that Solomon, my son, would be the successor on the throne. But now Adonias has self-proclaimed king, and if this continues, Solomon and I will be treated as enemies when you're no longer here." There was emotion in his words, but also strategy. She knew that even weakened David would understand the severity of the moment. As she spoke, Nathan came in to confirm her words and reinforce the urgency of the situation. David, listening to them, recovered a glimpse of the force that had made him a great leader in the past. He made his decision. He called his counselors and gave clear orders. Solomon would be anointed king that same day. He would be placed in his royal mule and led by all Jerusalem, proclaimed before all the people. When the news from David's decree spread, the palace was taken by a mixture of celebration and confusion. Adonias and his allies heard the shouts of joy from the city, and suddenly the party they planned became silent. But to Bathsheba, the moment was just the beginning of his new position beside the throne. The moment that marked Solomon's rise to the throne was like a flash of light that dispelled the shadows of conspiracy in the kingdom. With the order of David, Solomon was anointed king before the people, and the sound of the trumpets echoed by Jerusalem as a sign that God's will was being fulfilled. The young prince, now king, was greeted with joy and acclamation, and even those who had supported Adonias understood that fighting the new king was to fight the divine plan itself. Bathsheba, who had witnessed so many twists in his life, now became the queen mother, a figure of immense importance and respect in the kingdom. In her position, she not only advised Solomon, but was also a symbol of strength and redemption. Despite the marks of the past, its role was clear: to ensure the stability of the kingdom and support the son in the grandiose task before him. Solomon, since the beginning of his reign, demonstrated that it was different. He sought the wisdom of God above all, and in a dream, when the Lord appeared to him, he asked no riches or power, but understanding to govern his people with righteousness. It was a request that not only pleased God, but reflected the legacy that David and Bathsheba had left him. Solomon's wisdom became famous around the world, and his reign was marked by peace and prosperity as never before in Israel. But even with the brightness of this new era, the memories of the way until then remained. Every stone that Bathsheba stepped on the palace seemed to carry echoes from his past. From the terrace where he had been seen by David to the place where Nathan confronted the king, from tears shed by the loss of his first child to the celebration of Solomon's coronation. Her story, intertwined with that of Israel, was living proof that God, in his infinite wisdom, can turn even the darker moments into something extraordinary. Bathsheba's story is, above all, a story of transformation. She started as an ordinary woman, involved in a sequence of events that could have defined her forever. However, what makes her journey so powerful is not just what happened to her, but what she became along the way. Bathsheba crossed moments of pain, loss, and even shame, but instead of being consumed by them, he found strength to move on and a greater purpose that would change Israel's story. Your life teaches us that no one is beyond redemption. Even at times when it seemed to be just a piece in the midst of power games, God was working on his story, weaving something bigger. His position as mother of Solomon, the wisest king of Israel, and part of the lineage that would lead to Christ, shows that God not only restores, but even uses the most complicated moments of our lives to fulfill their plans. There is also a deep lesson on repentance and grace. Both Drunk and David had to face their choices and live with the consequences, but that was not the end. The pain of loss, especially from the first child, brought a profound change in their lives. They have learned that despite human failures, God's love and mercy are stronger. No matter how distant someone has gone, God is able to bring redemption and new beginnings. Finally, Bathsheba shows us the power of perseverance and wisdom. She protected Solomon, fought for her future, and assured that God's plan be fulfilled. Even without perfect, your story is a living example of how God uses imperfect people to perform grandiose purposes. In the end, his life was not defined by error, but by the grace that turned it into a pillar of strength and faith to the kingdom of Israel. Your journey is an invitation to reflect on how God can use our lives, even in times of greatest difficulty, for something much bigger than we can imagine. If you liked the Bathsheba story and want to keep following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to enjoy this video and share with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.